Okay, so when it comes to predictive environmental modeling, as an introductory slide, generally speaking, there are two, I'll just stay here to see everybody, two alternative, if not historically conflicting approaches. One, transparent approach that deals with predicting adverse effect or toxic action from chemical structure by identifying so-called structural alerts. Second is black box QSAR modeling. So that's the general framework for everybody to get oriented as to how, generally speaking, predictions happen. Based on this framework, this is what I want to touch on. First, and give examples. Chemicals don't know what we call them. We call them pesticides. We call them environmental agents. We call them drugs. And all of them have toxicity. We frequently cluster them by toxicity. A little anecdote, since Imran is here. His boss, at some point, that's when this started, named Rusty Thomas, when he was still at Hamner, had an illuminating conversation with me. And the conversation was, we discussed our inability to build good models for toxcast first group of chemicals, pesticides, right? We discussed this, and I said, I cannot build a good model because this data set is not modelable, which was the first time I used this term. We now have a paper talking about modelable and non-modelable data sets. And he asked why, and I said, because they're very different chemicals. And if you try to model chemically dissimilar molecules in a single QSAR, it's likely to fail because QSAR is about similarity. And these are very diverse chemicals. And he said it's impossible. They're all pesticides. Okay. He's learned more about chemical structure since then. We had much more illuminating conversation.
He's on the line listening to
He could confirm. He could go Imran, but I know you wanted to hear this. So that's number one. So we need to cluster them by chemical structure and search for diverse biological activities. When chemicals act, they do this as a whole, not as a fragment. And so it's important to have, this is a bizarre term. Internet and Microsoft Word don't know the word holistic. They tend to correct it without the first W. And I would say what we do in science is holistic in the proper sense of the word. I'm becoming a little bit religious, right? And then model accuracy and interpretability must be in balance. So models have to combine transparency of alerts that I showed you and rigor of statistical QSAR. So that's as a general premise of what any modeling should be. You could bark at me anytime you want. Here is one example of a recent study that was published, I think, earlier this year, where it sort of came as a social request from one of the cosmetics company, and they were looking for models on the internet to predict toxicity of their structures. That was the starting point. No time to talk about it. But they shared with us a database of pesticides, right? Those molecules that are all one single class, easy to model, drugs and cosmetics. And what we found initially is that the overlap in their designation was relatively low. But there were a few molecules that, there were even 99 molecules that were used as drugs and pesticides and cosmetics. But majority had very, very well rigidly defined boundaries of their applications, not even pharmacological agents. As chem informaticians, however, we found a completely different picture, and that is that everything was everywhere. There were very, very few unique islands. It's not an SAR map even. It's structure industrial application relationship, right? That's the map of structure industrial application relationship. It's structural distribution covered by application areas, and the whole world is covered. And that's published earlier this year, but that's the summary of observations that we've had. Historically, vast majority of toxicity models have been developed separately for these industrial classes, because that's what we know. That's where our boundaries of our thoughts are, not surprisingly. However, when we build models for each of these industrial application specific groups and looked at chemical overlap, we found that each model could predict up to 90% of, in general, of all chemicals in this combined data set. And what this means is that models developed for drugs or pesticides could be used to predict toxicity of drugs. Drug toxicity models could predict environmental compounds, etc. And so that was a plausible outcome of the study. I think it's plausible. Basically says what I said on the beginning, toxicity is toxicity. Chemicals don't know how we call them. They just act. Now, I'm not an original creator of this line. I've heard it many years ago from Ken Deal, an authority in protein folding, who said about protein folding problem. I know Imran at some point was interested in that. That protein folding problem is problem for us, not for proteins. They just fold. So the same applies to chemicals. Here is a little bit more about the second point, which is compounds act as a whole. Structural alerts are increasingly, and I will say crazily, popular as tools to forecast compound toxicity. Why? Because it's simple, and we look for simplicity everywhere, even if we better not. And so this paradigm of structural alerts means toxicity, and therefore industrial compounds, environmental chemicals, and drugs can be considered toxic if they have an alert, has become an extraordinary popular and key to toxicity prediction. Everybody knows the sad story of OECD QSAR Toolbox. I think they still don't recognize that it's a sad story, but it's a sad story, and I'm willing to say it in every forum. I used to be on the advisory board representing an animal control or animal defense group, whatever, because you cannot defend chemicals better than being a QSAR modeler, right? We need dry data. So I was witnessing how this was developed, and it was and continues to be awful. I hope Vanyas is listening, Vanyas Mikhayan. But this is how it's done, right? So you have a new chemical, you compare it by its composition to other chemicals. If other chemicals are toxic, then this one is toxic too, if it has an alert. So what it says in the toolbox manual is that read-across approach endpoint information, one chemical is used to predict the same endpoint for others, okay, etc. Now, I'm asking you if these molecules are good molecules or bad molecules, and what they're drugs, widely popular, but nevertheless, all of them have chemical alerts of toxicity. And if you see an alert, you get scared and go away, run away from those chemicals. So they should have never been developed as drugs, but they were. And we continue to use them and continue to live, despite all of these alerts. And so the study observed that approximately half of the top 200 drugs, now top 200 by sales, for prescription sales contain one or more alerts in their chemical architecture. And many were reaction metabolite positive. So just bad actors. Nevertheless, again, somehow humans and animals continue to live. In our investigation of skin sensitization, of data of compounds that were used in QSAR Toolbox to predict skin sensitization, and we've built an alternative statistical QSAR models. So we've looked at predicting the same external data set in parallel by QSAR Toolbox, by transparent, wonderful, OECD-supported, multi-million euro funded model, and our simple, no longer EPA supported because they don't support external research anymore, just free model, okay? And so I'm skipping statistically, that model was, statistical model was stronger in every respect except for one. Alerts have high sensitivity. Everything is predicted as toxic, which is why all toxic molecules are predicted accurate, okay? Just need to get that. And that's hidden by total accuracy, and it's hidden by telling you that they've predicted toxic compounds accurately. If every compound is predicted as toxic, all toxic compounds will be predicted accurately. That's a subtle statistical point you have to keep in mind. And that's an example. Okay, QSAR Toolbox finds this alerting group and says, therefore, it's a sensitizer. Okay, experiment says not. QSAR says not. QSAR has its own flows, but I'm biased in my talk naturally. And showing you one example because of lack of time. I would criticize QSAR if I had more time. Anyway, that's what happens with alerts. I want you to understand the mechanism why it happens, right? This is highly restricted. And what no one looks at is, let me look and extract all chemicals that have any particular substructure. By default, they're all suspects, okay? And many chemicals may have any particular substructure. But nobody is looking at the recovery rate, right? What we should do is take the entire rich database, take any particular alert and profile compounds, and you will see how many hits you're going to find. And half of the rich database may, well, not half is probably exaggeration, but thousands of compounds may be labeled as potentially toxic. Okay, that's how it works. Nobody does that. So remember, QSAR Toolbox is a predictive tool, right? Alerts, predictions. That's written in all of this. Here is another commercial software called Toxtree, and if you read it relatively recently, they said something funny. Available since Toxtree under the name Skin Sensitization Alerts and Skin Sensitization Alerts. What is this? British spelling. The name is changed to Skin Sensitization Reactivity Domain in order to reflect the fact that alerts provide grouping into reactivity mode of action and do not predict skin sensitization potential, right? And that's when I had this mental picture of the use of alerts to predict chemicals, right? Because that's what they are telling you. It's right. An alert is an extremely convenient concept, as convenient as being a consultant. You have no responsibility, right? Because if you're correct, you said I've told you so. If you're not correct, you said I'm just a consultant, right? It's just an alert. It's a fantastic use of the English language. So that's the problem. Now, what about possible solution? And solution should be based on statistical modeling and interpretative and transparent. That's what we want. We want statistical rigor and transparency. So a methodology that we have developed, and it's just about to be published. We've got favorable reviews, and we've called it MUDRA. That's how you say it, MUDRA, something like this. MUDRA. Imran should know the proper pronunciation. So it's a word in Sanskrit, turned out. Now, I read this after coming up with this abbreviation, because earlier we had a method called CBRA, chemical biological read across, borrowed from my group and implemented by EPA at some point. So the name was better. I'm talking about implementation. Okay, so so that has the same in theory. This is the same approach, but it's used to combine multiple types of chemical descriptors and then develop a prediction based on nearest neighbor in each individual descriptor space. It's a very conceptually simple approach that we've called multi-descriptor read across instead of chemical biological read across. And when I came up with this, I started looking for this abbreviation. I found not only it's a word in Sanskrit, and it's used extensively as a word designating the meaning of various more than 100 gestures in Hinduism. But it has this meaning of an energetic seal of authenticity. And that, I think, basically speaks volume about this methodology as the one, the only. So basically, QSR models could pack their bags, we've solved the problem, right? But that's this methodology, and it has statistical rigor and transparency. This is just statistical slide. It does not work any better statistically than other alternative tools, but what we're comparing here is the famous or in to be learned. That's 5 seconds or 5 minutes? Minutes. That's left or over? Yes. All right, I'm almost done, actually. And so this is this huge exercise, and I think it's the right thing to do. I've taken about 20 plus groups around the world, maybe more than that, and developing a single consensus QSAR model of estrogenicity. Okay, and so it's a consensus modeling. MUDRA is a consensus modeling, but instead of integrating models, we integrate descriptors and then use a single methodology, very simple methodology, nearest neighbor on top of it. So it kind of has this consensus, but the consensus is sort of hidden. We're getting identical, more or less, accuracy, generally speaking. So correct classification rate is balanced accuracy for different types of models. And basically what we're saying is it's much, much conceptually simpler than integrating multiple groups around the world to get the same accuracy. The reason we need to do this integration, which is why I'm supportive of CERAPP-like projects, is that we have a huge challenge, and that's a task for groups like yours, to convince regulatory agencies to use and rely on models much stronger. And one of the ways of doing this is when you bring together everybody, and everybody participates. And so if they want to challenge this model, there is no one left standing, except for novices. So I think strategically it's a smart approach. But that has the same kind of meaning. People develop descriptors and get statistically similar models. So that's just about to be published. So my last slide is what I think we need to do. And what it reflects is that we want both. We want simple rules and we want statistical accuracy. And so basically, QSAR model being a black box is insensitive to why you think a compound is toxic or non-toxic. It tells you if it's toxic or non-toxic. It does not tell you why. And the whys are expected by chemists who need to know how to modify a chemical, and or by regulators who need to understand at some rudimentary level why one compound is toxic and second is not. And so what we're proposing, and we started pushing this several years ago, is that a combination between rule-based hypothesis and statistical validation by black box models, right? One has transparency, second has statistical rigor, and huge, huge, huge data sets behind it, allows you to bring this together in a form of hypothesis generation, hypothesis validation. And if hypothesis is validated by statistical modeling, then you've got an interpretation as well. If not, then forget it, and then the model doesn't work. So isolated alerts have limited predictive power. The influence of alerts on compound toxicity depends on their structural environment. That's the holistic modeling. And then the hypothesis thing that I just stated. Thank you. Oh, of course, I did not do any of that. And to repeat what Steve Heller typically says, the opinions expressed in the slides are those of the slides. Thank you.